All right, so, like, buckle up, everybody, because we are diving head first into uh, some pretty major changes in Canadian politics today.
Definitely major.
Yeah, so we're talking 2025 things between Canada and the U.S. They've been kind of, frosty, a little bit icy the last few years.
Yeah.
And then, bam, Canada elects a brand new prime minister.
And not just any prime minister.
Right, like this is,
This is Mark Carney.
this is Mark Carney. Okay, so that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's not like every day you see a former central banker, just jump right into the political scene.
Right.
Let alone one who's like, led both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England.
And the first non-citizen.
First non-citizen to head the Bank of England, too.
Exactly.
So, like, this guy's resume is pretty impressive.
It's fascinating. It's not just the central bank stuff, too, right? But his time at Goldman Sachs.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this isn't just some academic economist.
Right.
Like, he's been in the rooms with, the folks who control a lot of global money and global power.
Okay, so we've got an economic heavyweight, stepping into the political ring.
Mm-hmm.
What's the context here? Like, what made this election so, significant? Why should people care about this?
Well, you really have to remember the backdrop of U.S.-Canada relations. The last few years have been, well, things were strained under the Trump administration.
Oh, yeah.
And those tensions, they haven't exactly gone away.
Right, we're talking like trade wars.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that whole annexation threat thing.
Oh, yeah.
Like, for our listeners who might have missed it, there was basically Trump, like, suggesting that the U.S. might just absorb Canada.
It was a wild time.
Yeah, it was a wild time. And, for Canadians, I mean, that was kind of
It shook them up a little bit.
It shook them up, right. Like, at first there was disbelief, and then there was anger, and ultimately, like, it fueled this growing sense of nationalism. And I feel like that's really where Carney's campaign comes in, right?
Mm.
He really tapped into that sentiment, brilliantly.
Yeah.
Remember all those powerful speeches about Canada winning, and he kept making all those comparisons to, like, hockey rivalries,
Yeah.
and constantly emphasizing, like those core Canadian values, like universal health care.
And he presented himself as, like, the defender of Canadian interests, someone who would stand up to the U.S., protect their way of life.
And it worked. 85.9% of the vote.
I mean,
That's unheard of.
that's not just a victory, that's a landslide.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Like, that really speaks volumes about the mood of the nation, right?
He really does.
But I guess the big question is, like, how much of this was just, like, Carney's charisma versus him, like, riding this wave of, I don't know if we want to call it Canada first, but, like,
Yeah.
Canada first sentiment that was already there.
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, he's compelling. He's a compelling figure, no doubt.
Yeah.
But he was also, like, incredibly strategic about his campaign and the message that he was putting out there.
Right.
He hammered home this message that Canada was under threat.
Right.
And he positioned himself as, like, the solution.
So we've got a new PM, with a bold mandate.
Yeah.
Strong sense of national pride. But there's another layer to this story, right? Like, there's
always another layer.
There's always another layer.
Yeah.
We've got the defeated candidate, Chrystia Freeland.
Yeah.
Not only did she lose, but she dramatically resigned as deputy prime minister before the election even happened.
Right.
And was publicly criticizing Trudeau's government.
Very publicly.
Very publicly, yeah. So what was that all about?
Well, Freeland's resignation really exposed some deep cracks, I think, within the Liberal Party. She was very critical of Trudeau's handling of the economy. Specifically, like, rising costs of living and the impact of immigration on housing affordability. I think her departure signaled, like, a loss of confidence in Trudeau's leadership.
So Trudeau's popularity was already kind of, on the downswing.
He was waning, yeah.
Waning, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then Freeland's resignation throws, even more fuel on the fire.
Yeah, it was not a great look.
Not a great look. So Carney taps into all this nationalistic energy and sweeps to victory. But what does this actually mean for Canada? Like, what's the
takeaway here?
What's the takeaway?
I think it means that Canada is entering a new era, an era where they're less willing to play the role of the agreeable neighbor, and they're going to be more assertive about their place on the world stage.
And how might this impact the U.S.? Because let's be real, this isn't just a Canadian story.
Yeah.
Like, what happens up north has ripple effects down here, too. So What should our listeners in the U.S. be paying attention to?
I think there are a few key things to watch. First, Carney has zero political experience.
Right, he's a total outsider.
Total outsider, yeah. So will that be an asset or a liability? We'll see.
It could go either way.
It could go either way, yeah.
Totally.
And second, how will he balance this wave of Canadian nationalism with the need to have, a stable relationship with the U.S.?
Right, because they're still our biggest trading partner.
They're still your biggest trading partner, exactly.
Okay, so we've got a new PM with a bold vision, nation eager to assert their independence.
Yeah.
And a whole lot of uncertainty about what comes next.
Yeah, the plot thickens.
It does. This deep dive is just getting started.
It really is. This is where it gets really interesting.
Oh.
Because what happens next could completely reshape, the whole dynamic of North America.
Ooh, ominous.
Buckle up.
Okay, so we've got a political novice running the show now, a whole country brimming with national pride, and this historically close relationship with the U.S. that, well, let's just say things have gotten a bit complicated.
Yeah, a little messy.
A little messy, yeah. So where do we even begin to, unpack all of this?
Well, I think a good place to start is with the potential for a snap election.
Okay.
Carney could call one himself to, really solidify his mandate, or, the opposition parties could try to force one through a no-confidence vote.
Okay, wait, hold on. For those of us who, aren't Canadian politics experts, what does a no-confidence vote even mean?
Right, good point.
How does that work?
So basically, it's a way for Parliament to say, hey, we don't really support the government right now.
Okay.
And if enough members vote against the government, then it triggers a whole new election.
Oh, wow.
It's a pretty high-stakes move.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a possibility, given this whole situation.
So there's a real chance that we could see Canadians, back at the polls.
Oh, yeah.
Sooner rather than later.
Potentially.
Okay, so let's say Carney does secure his position one way or another.
Right.
The big question is, how's he actually going to handle this, delicate relationship with the U.S.?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
He talked tough on the campaign trail.
He did.
But will that actually translate into real action?
Right.
Or was that just, rhetoric to get votes?
It's a tough balancing act, right? Because on the one hand, he needs to show Canadians that he's, not afraid to stand up for them. But on the other hand, he doesn't want to, completely alienate the U.S., right? Who is their biggest trading partner?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where I think his background gets really interesting, right?
Okay.
Because he's not a, career politician.
Right.
He's a pragmatist.
Right.
He understands the global economy. He knows how to negotiate.
Yeah.
And I think he's probably more comfortable, working behind the scenes than having these big public spats.
So maybe we see a more, subtle approach,
Yeah.
less of the fiery rhetoric, more strategic maneuvering.
Maybe.
But he's also got to deliver on some of those campaign promises, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Those Canadians who voted for him, they expect him to take action.
For sure. And that's where things could get a little,
Tricky.
tricky. Yeah.
Right.
Let's say he starts pushing back on trade. Imposes tariffs,
Right.
or just takes a hard line on some of these more contentious issues.
Yeah.
I mean, that could have a real impact on the U.S. economy.
Right. We could be talking higher prices for consumers, supply chain disruptions.
Yeah.
Maybe even travel restrictions, right?
For sure.
All those snowbird trips to Florida.
Right.
Those could become a thing of the past.
It's not, totally out of the question.
And it's not just about economics either. Carney has a really strong record on climate change.
Oh, absolutely.
He was the UN's special envoy for climate action.
Yeah, he's not messing around with that stuff.
No, he's made it really clear that's a priority for him. So how does that play out with the U.S.? Especially if, our climate policies are kind of out of sync.
Right. Well, that could become a major, sticking point.
Yeah.
If Canada starts to see the U.S. as, a laggard on climate, it could really strain the relationship. It becomes about more than just trade and economics,
Yeah.
It becomes about values and
Right.
priorities.
Yeah, so this is where it gets, super fascinating for me because suddenly we're not just talking about dollars and cents. We're talking about two countries with, potentially different visions for the future.
Right.
Trying to figure out how to navigate
Yeah.
this relationship that has become so complex.
Yeah, and it's all happening against this backdrop of, rising Canadian nationalism.
Right.
They're finding their voice. They're asserting their independence.
Yeah.
And they're not afraid to do things their own way.
But what does that actually look like for, like, everyday Canadians? Like, how's this power shift playing out, on the ground?
Well, imagine you're a Canadian right now.
Okay.
There's a sense of pride, like we're standing up to the big brother next door.
Right.
But there's also this sense of uncertainty, right? Like, what does this new assertiveness mean for, like, your job?
Right.
Your cost of living, your ability to travel.
It's a little bit like being on a roller coaster, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's, like, the thrill of the unknown, the excitement of, like, going up the hill.
Yeah.
But also that, like, nervous anticipation of what's going to happen next.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's really the sentiment that we're picking up from, talking to people in Canada.
Oh, interesting.
There's this buzz of, like, we don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be big.
And that brings us back to you, dear listener.
Right.
Because this isn't just some faraway political drama playing out on another stage. Right. This is a story that could have, like, real implications for all of us.
Absolutely.
What happens in Canada doesn't stay in Canada.
No, it's all interconnected. The decisions Carney makes, the path that Canada chooses. I mean, those ripple effects, they're going to be felt across the border and potentially, across the globe.
So as we head into the final part of our deep dive, we want you to really think about this.
Yeah.
Imagine you're advising Mark Carney right now.
Okay.
What's the one thing that he should do to protect Canadian interests while also finding a way to, like, mend those fences with the U.S.?
It's a tough one.
The delicate balancing act.
It really is.
Yeah. Okay, so we've gone from, like, Trump's eyebrow-raising annexation threat to Carney's huge landslide victory to, like, really dissecting what this means for both Canada and the U.S.
Yeah, it's been quite a ride.
It has been a ride. So before we wrap things up, let's try to distill this down to the essentials.
Okay.
What are the big can't-miss takeaways here?
Well, I think the first one is pretty clear. Canada is in a nationalistic mood.
Yeah.
There's this, like, newfound confidence, a willingness to stand up for their own interests, even if it ruffles some feathers, south of the border.
And leading the charge is this, like, political newcomer, Mark Carney, who's got the, economic experience.
Oh, yeah.
The charisma. And judging by those campaign speeches, a pretty clear vision for putting, Canada first.
Yeah, he definitely knows how to play to the crowd.
He does. But what's really fascinating to me is, like, how this signals a potential shift in, like, the balance of power in North America.
Right.
Because for decades it's been, the U.S. calling the shots, setting the agenda.
Right.
But now you have Canada, like, flexing its muscles a little bit.
Yeah.
Asserting its autonomy.
It's a new era.
It is. It is a new era. Okay, so that's a pretty big deal. But what does a more assertive Canada actually look like in practice?
Yeah.
Like, how might the U.S. react to this shift?
That's the question that keeps me up at night.
Really?
Yeah. Will the U.S. try and, like, double down, reassert its dominance? Or will they be forced to adapt to a more, independent-minded Canada?
Yeah.
It's gonna be fascinating to watch how this all plays out.
I love how what seemed like such a simple news story.
Right.
Like, new prime minister. Okay, cool.
Yeah, like, whatever.
Yeah. Has turned into this, like, deep dives into geopolitics.
Yeah.
Economics, national identity.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
It is.
Every layer you peel back, there's something even more,
more interesting.
more intriguing.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of, like, informed analysis, right? It's not just about knowing the facts.
Right.
It's about, like, understanding the why, the interconnectedness, the potential consequences.
Absolutely.
And speaking of consequences, we challenged you, our listeners, with a pretty big question earlier.
We did.
Like, if you were advising Mark Carney right now, what's the one move he should make to, protect Canadian interests while also smoothing things over with the U.S.?
It's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
Yeah.
It's like walking a tightrope, finding that sweet spot between standing your ground and extending an olive branch.
Exactly.
And that, my friend, is why we love these deep dives.
It's the best part.
It is. It's not about, like, easy answers. It's about grappling with these, like, complex issues,
Mm-hmm.
exploring different perspectives,
Yeah.
and hopefully leaving you with more questions than you started with.
Always more questions.
Always more questions, because ultimately this story is far from over.
Oh, no, this is just the beginning.
It is. It's just the beginning of a new chapter in this, ever-evolving relationship between Canada and the U.S.
It's going to be a wild ride.
And we can't wait to see how it all unfolds.
Me neither.
So stay tuned, stay curious, and keep those thinking caps on.
And thanks for joining us.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.